The screen door slammed with the same metallic clatter it had made every summer morning for as long as anyone could remember. 7-year-old Michael Torres had burst through it like he owned the world, his untied sneakers slapping against the wooden porch steps of the small ranch house on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa. It was July 15, 1998, and the air hung thick with the promise of another scorching Midwest afternoon. If this reminds you of a childhood moment that slipped away too quickly, share this story with someone who might remember the weight of those carefree summer days. His mother, Elena, watched from the kitchen window as Michael raced toward the old oak tree where his bicycle waited. The red Huffy with the banana seat had been his birthday gift 3 months earlier, and he rode it everywhere, to the corner store for penny candy, to his friend Tommy's house 2 blocks over, to the small creek that ran behind the Methodist church. Elena had always worried about that creek, but Michael was a strong swimmer, and Cedar Falls was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, where children still played outside until the streetlights came on. The morning routine never varied. Michael would gulp down his cereal while Elena packed his lunch: peanut butter and grape jelly on white bread, a bag of chips, and a thermos of chocolate milk. He'd kiss her cheek, promise to be home by 5, and disappear into the neighborhood until the dinner bell rang from their back porch. It was 1998, before cell phones and GPS trackers, when a mother's peace of mind rested on trust and the unspoken safety net of a small community. Elena remembered the weight of the July heat that morning, how it seemed to press against the windows and make the house feel smaller. She had planned to spend the day canning peaches, a tradition passed down from her own mother. The kitchen counter was already lined with mason jars, their metal lids gleaming in the morning sunlight that streamed through the curtains she'd sewn herself during the long winter months. Michael's father, David, had left for his shift at the grain elevator before dawn, his lunch pail clanking against his leg as he walked to the truck. David worked hard, came home tired, but never too tired to throw a baseball with Michael in the backyard or help him with the model airplane they'd been building together in the garage. They were a family that moved in predictable rhythms, anchored by routine and the quiet contentment of small-town life. That Tuesday had started like any other. The local radio station played the same mix of country music and farm reports that accompanied Elena's morning coffee. She heard Michael's voice drifting in through the open windows as he called out to Mrs. Henderson next door, asking if he could pick some of her blackberries later. Mrs. Henderson, a widow in her 70s who treated Michael like the grandson she'd never had, always said yes. She would watch him from her porch swing, making sure he didn't scratch himself on the thorns, and sent him home with extra berries for Elena to make into jam. The neighborhood hummed with the familiar sounds of summer: lawnmowers starting up, screen doors opening and closing, the distant laughter of children at the community pool 6 blocks away. Cedar Falls had been built around the grain elevator and the railroad tracks that cut through its center like a spine. Most families had lived there for generations, their histories intertwined, like the branches of the old elm trees that line the residential streets. Elena had grown up in that same house on Maple Street, had married David in the white clapboard church on Main Street, and had always assumed Michael would do the same. Grow up, graduate from Cedar Falls High, maybe go to community college in the next town over, then return to raise his own children in the house where 4 generations of her family had already lived and loved and died. She remembered standing at the sink that morning, washing the breakfast dishes and watching Michael through the window. He was adjusting something on his bicycle chain, his dark hair falling across his forehead, in the way that reminded her so much of David at that age. Michael had his father's stubborn concentration and his mother's quick smile, traits that made him popular with the other children and beloved by the adults who knew him. The last time Elena saw her son that morning, he was pedaling down Maple Street toward downtown, his red bicycle weaving slightly as he navigated around the potholes that the city council had been promising to fix for 3 years. She watched until he turned the corner by the Hendersons' house and disappeared from view, swallowed by the maze of tree-lined streets that made up their small world. By noon, when Michael hadn't returned for lunch, as he sometimes did, Elena felt the first flutter of unease. By 3 o'clock, when Tommy's mother called to ask if Michael was coming over to play, that flutter had grown into something harder to ignore. By 5:30, when David's truck pulled into the driveway and Michael's bicycle was nowhere to be seen, Elena knew with the terrible certainty that only mothers possess that something was wrong. The official search began at sunset, when Sheriff Morrison organized teams of volunteers to comb through every backyard, every alley, every patch of woods within a 5-mile radius of town. They searched the creek behind the Methodist church with flashlights and prayers, called Michael's name until their voices grew hoarse, and knocked on every door in Cedar Falls, asking the same desperate questions. For 3 weeks, the town held its breath. Missing child posters appeared on telephone poles and in store windows. Elena's kitchen table became command central, covered with maps and phone lists, and the business cards of FBI agents who spoke in measured tones about statistics and possibilities that no parent ever wants to hear. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the intensive search was called off. Michael Torres had vanished as completely as morning mist over the cornfields, leaving behind only questions that would echo through Cedar Falls for the next 25 years. The months that followed Michael's disappearance moved like a slow healing wound through the heart of Cedar Falls. Elena Torres stopped canning peaches that summer, unable to bear the sweet smell that had once meant abundance and now only reminded her of the morning her world had broken apart. The mason jars sat empty on the kitchen counter for weeks, gathering dust like everything else in a house where time seemed to have stopped on July 15, 1998. David threw himself into work with the desperate intensity of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. He picked up extra shifts at the grain elevator, volunteered for weekend maintenance, and spent long hours in the garage working on the model airplane that he and Michael had never finished. The delicate balsa wood frame sat on his workbench like a prayer frozen in time, its wings partially covered with tissue paper that yellowed as the seasons changed. The community rallied around the Torres family with the fierce loyalty that small towns reserve for their own in times of crisis. Casseroles appeared on their doorstep without invitation. The Methodist Church organized prayer vigils that filled the sanctuary with candlelight and whispered supplications. Mrs. Henderson, despite her arthritis, mowed their lawn every week without being asked, her ancient push mower leaving neat diagonal patterns in the grass that Michael would never again run through barefoot. Sheriff Morrison, a man who had spent 30 years believing that every mystery had a solution if you looked hard enough, found himself staring at a case file that defied explanation. Michael had simply vanished from the face of the earth. No witnesses, no suspicious vehicles, no evidence of foul play or accident. The FBI agents, with their sophisticated theories and behavioral profiles, had returned to their offices in Des Moines and Chicago, leaving behind only business cards and the hollow promise to call if any new leads developed. The first anniversary came and went with a memorial service that packed the Methodist Church beyond capacity. Elena stood at the podium in a black dress that hung too loose on her diminished frame and spoke about hope in a voice that cracked like autumn leaves. She talked about Michael's love of baseball cards and his habit of leaving his socks on the bathroom floor and the way he laughed at his own jokes before the punchline. The congregation wept with her, and for the terrible randomness of a world where 7-year-old boys could disappear on sunny Tuesday mornings. As the second year began, life in Cedar Falls started to move forward in the halting, guilty way that life always does. The missing child posters began to fade and peel from their telephone poles. New crises demanded attention. Mrs. Patterson's house fire, the closure of the implement dealer on Main Street, the high school's unexpected run to the state basketball championship. People still thought about Michael Torres, still wondered what had happened to that sweet boy with the crooked smile, but the desperate urgency of the search had settled into the quiet ache of unanswered questions. Elena developed rituals to survive the endless waiting. She kept Michael's room exactly as he had left it, his Batman sheets still tangled from that last morning, his collection of Hot Wheels cars lined up on the dresser in the precise order he had arranged them. Every Tuesday, she baked chocolate chip cookies, Michael's favorites, and left them on the kitchen counter until they grew stale. She told herself it was just in case, but David knew she was feeding a hope that had become both her anchor and her torment. The marriage began to fracture under the weight of grief that neither of them knew how to carry. David's silence grew deeper, his refuge in the garage more complete. Elena talked compulsively about Michael, what he might look like now, where he might be living, whether he remembered them, until David would leave the room with the hunted look of a man being slowly drowned by possibilities he couldn't control. In the third year, they tried counseling with Pastor Williams, sitting in his book-lined office while he guided them through conversations about acceptance and faith and the mysterious workings of God's plan. Elena emerged from these sessions feeling emptier than when she'd entered, as if the very act of discussing Michael's absence made it more real, more permanent. David stopped attending after the 6th session, claiming he couldn't afford to miss any more work. The detective who replaced Sheriff Morrison when he retired was younger, more interested in drug cases and domestic disputes than cold files gathering dust in the basement of the courthouse. Michael's case was transferred to a filing cabinet marked inactive, though Elena called every 6 months to ask if there had been any developments. The answer was always the same, polite, sympathetic, no. By the 5th year, Elena had returned to work at the library part-time, finding comfort in the ordered world of books and the gentle routine of stamping due dates and shelving returns. She became the unofficial keeper of Michael's memory, mentioning him in conversations with patrons who remembered, sharing stories about his love of adventure books and his dream of becoming a pilot like Charles Lindbergh. David sold the grain elevator and bought a small auto repair shop on the outskirts of town, a business that allowed him to work alone with his hands and his thoughts. He never talked about Michael anymore, but Elena sometimes caught him staring at boys who would have been Michael's age, his eyes following them with an expression of longing so raw it made her turn away. The 6th year brought a false hope when a boy matching Michael's description was found in Missouri, living with a family who claimed they had adopted him legally. Elena and David made the 8-hour drive in David's pickup truck, their hands clasped so tightly across the bench seat that their knuckles went white. The boy had Michael's dark hair and build, but when he turned to face them, his eyes were the wrong color. His smile belonged to someone else's child. The drive home passed in silence that felt like death. As the decade mark approached, Cedar Falls had largely moved on from the mystery of Michael Torres. New families had moved into the neighborhood. Children who had never heard his name played in the same parks where he had ridden his red bicycle. The old oak tree where he had left his bike that final morning was struck by lightning during a summer storm and had to be cut down, its absence leaving a strange empty space in the landscape that somehow felt appropriate. Elena and David's marriage quietly ended in the 11th year, not with arguments or accusations, but with the slow recognition that they had become strangers sharing a house full of memories neither could bear to face. David moved to an apartment above his shop, and Elena stayed in the house on Maple Street, surrounded by the artifacts of a life that had stopped moving forward on a July morning that felt both like yesterday and a lifetime ago. The questions never stopped, but they changed shape over time. In the early years, Elena had tortured herself with visions of kidnapping and worse. As time passed, she began to construct elaborate fantasies where Michael had somehow escaped, had been taken in by kind strangers who couldn't have children of their own, had grown up in a loving home somewhere far from Cedar Falls. These stories, she told herself, were both comfort and torment, because if they were true, it meant Michael was alive but had never tried to come home. By the 10th year, the absence of Michael Torres had become a permanent feature of Cedar Falls, Iowa, like the grain elevator or the railroad tracks, something the town had grown around and learned to live with. The anniversary of his disappearance no longer warranted front-page coverage in the Cedar Falls Gazette, though reporter Sarah Chen always included a small paragraph in the July edition, reminding readers that the case remained open and asking anyone with information to contact the police department. Elena had developed her own private calendar around Michael's memory. July 15th was always taken as a vacation day from her job at the library, spent in solitude at the house on Maple Street. She would spend the morning in Michael's room, running her fingers over the model airplanes they had bought but never built, reading aloud from the Hardy Boys books he had loved, talking to him as if he might walk through the door at any moment. In the afternoon, she would bake his favorite cookies and take them to Mrs. Henderson, who was now 91 and spent most of her time in a wheelchair by the front window, watching the street with eyes that still held hope. The house itself had become a monument to interrupted time. Elena had repainted the living room and kitchen over the years, updated the bathroom fixtures, replaced the old furnace with a more efficient model, but Michael's room remained untouched. His Batman bedsheets had faded to a pale blue, and the plastic action figures on his dresser bore a fine coating of dust, but everything remained exactly where he had left it on that July morning in 1998. David remarried in the 13th year, a quiet ceremony at the courthouse with a woman named Linda, who had also lost a child, her daughter to leukemia when she was 12. They understood each other's grief without needing to discuss it, finding comfort in shared silence and the knowledge that some wounds never fully heal. David still thought about Michael every day, but the sharp edge of desperation had worn smooth over time, becoming something he could carry without it cutting him with every breath. The neighborhood had changed slowly but inevitably. the Hendersons' house was sold to a young couple from Des Moines who painted it yellow and installed a modern security system. The Yamamoto family moved away when Mr. Yamamoto was transferred to his company's facility in California, and their house was purchased by empty nesters, who converted the large backyard into an elaborate garden. The elementary school where Michael would have attended was closed due to declining enrollment and converted into senior apartments. Elena often found herself studying the faces of young men who would be Michael's age, 25 in 2013, 30 in 2018, 32 now in 2023. She saw him in the checkout clerk at the grocery store, who had his same dark hair, in the mail carrier, who walked with Michael's confident stride, in the mechanic at David's old shop, who laughed with the same infectious joy she remembered. These moments of recognition always left her breathless, her heart hammering against her ribs until reason reasserted itself and she remembered that Michael was gone, that he would always be 7 years old in her memory, frozen forever on that last summer morning. The investigation had long since gone cold, but Elena had never stopped searching in her own way. She had learned to use the internet, spending hours scrolling through missing children databases and social media profiles, looking for any trace of a boy who might have grown up to be her son. She had contacted psychics and private investigators, most of whom took her money and offered vague promises about spiritual connections and new leads that never materialized. The rational part of her mind knew these efforts were futile, but the mother in her couldn't stop trying. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the therapist Elena had been seeing for the past 5 years, often talked about the concept of ambiguous loss, grief without closure, mourning without a body to bury. Elena had become something of an expert on the subject, reading everything she could find about families who had lost children to mysterious disappearances. The statistics were sobering. Most missing children who weren't found within the first few days were never found at all. But statistics had never comforted her, and she clung to the small percentage of cases where children had been recovered years or even decades later. The 20th anniversary in 2018 had brought renewed media attention, including a segment on a true crime podcast that reached millions of listeners across the country. Elena had agreed to be interviewed, hoping that someone, somewhere, might hear Michael's story and remember something crucial. The response had been overwhelming. Hundreds of tips and theories, and claimed sightings that the police had dutifully investigated and found to be false leads. The attention had been both hopeful and exhausting, reminding Elena of those first terrible weeks when she had believed that publicity and persistence would be enough to bring her son home. The house on Maple Street had become her sanctuary and her prison. She had considered moving dozens of times over the years, but the thought of leaving the place where Michael might return to find her always stopped her. What if he came home and found strangers living in his childhood bedroom? What if he stood on the front porch, 25 years older but still her little boy, and didn't know where to find his mother? These fears kept her rooted to the place where her heart had broken, tending to memories like a gardener tends to flowers that bloom only in the past. The neighbors who remembered Michael were growing older, moving away, or passing on. Mrs. Henderson had died peacefully in her sleep 3 years earlier, and Elena had been one of the pallbearers at her funeral, grieving not just for the loss of a friend, but for the death of another witness to Michael's existence. Each person who had known and loved her son was a thread connecting her to the reality of his life, and as those threads were severed by time and circumstance, Elena sometimes felt as though she was the only person left who remembered that Michael Torres had ever existed at all. The 25th anniversary was approaching now, and Elena found herself thinking more frequently about legacy and memory. She had started writing letters to Michael, long, rambling accounts of the life he had missed, the man she imagined he might have become, the grandmother she would never be. These letters filled several composition notebooks that she kept in his bedroom dresser, next to the school clothes he would never outgrow, and the Christmas presents she had continued buying and wrapping for the first 10 years after his disappearance. Cedar Falls had moved forward into the 21st century, with high-speed internet and chain restaurants, and a Walmart that had driven the old downtown merchants out of business. The train still came through twice a day, but it no longer stopped at the small depot that had been converted into an antique shop. Children still played in the parks and rode their bicycles through the neighborhoods, but they carried cell phones and wore helmets and were driven to scheduled activities by parents who lived in constant awareness of dangers that Elena's generation had never imagined. The mystery of Michael Torres had become part of the town's folklore, a story told in hushed voices and passed down like local legend. New residents sometimes asked about the house on Maple Street where the sad woman lived alone, and longtime residents would share what they remembered about that terrible summer when a little boy had vanished without a trace. The details had grown fuzzy over time, embellished or simplified depending on the storyteller, but the essential tragedy remained unchanged. On July 15, 1998, 7-year-old Michael Torres had ridden his red bicycle into the morning sunshine and never come home. Marcus Wellington had always been comfortable with not knowing where he came from. The story his adoptive parents, Robert and Catherine Wellington, had told him seemed reasonable enough. He had been placed in foster care as a toddler after his birth parents died in a car accident, and the Wellington family had welcomed him when he was 4 years old. The early memories before that age were vague and dreamlike, the way childhood memories often are, fragments of sensations and emotions that felt more like half-remembered dreams than actual experiences. Growing up in Burlington, Vermont, Marcus had lived a privileged life that bore no resemblance to the working-class world of Cedar Falls, Iowa. Robert Wellington was a successful architect, and Catherine was a professor of music theory at the University of Vermont. Their home was a restored Victorian on a tree-lined street near Lake Champlain, filled with books and classical music, and the kind of intellectual discourse that Marcus had always assumed was normal for all families. He had thrived in this environment, excelling in school and developing his own love for music that his mother encouraged, with piano lessons and trips to concerts in Boston and New York. The Wellingtons had been loving but honest parents. They had never hidden the fact that Marcus was adopted, and they had always promised to help him search for information about his biological family when he turned 18. But Marcus had never felt that pull toward his origins that he read about in adoption memoirs and saw dramatized in movies. Robert and Catherine were his parents in every way that mattered, and he was content with the family he had rather than obsessing over the one he had lost. Marcus had graduated from Middlebury College with a degree in music composition and had spent the last 7 years working as a freelance composer, creating soundtracks for independent films and music for small theater productions. He lived in a converted warehouse apartment in Burlington's Arts District, surrounded by keyboards and recording equipment and the organized chaos that creative people call home. At 32, he was successful enough to support himself doing work he loved, and he had never spent much time wondering about the path that had led him to this life. The revelation that would change everything began with a phone call on a rainy Thursday in October 2023. Marcus was in his home studio, working on a piece for a documentary about climate change, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. "Is this Marcus Wellington?" The voice was professional but kind, with a slight Midwestern accent that made Marcus think of old movies about small-town America. "Yes, this is Marcus. Who's calling?" "My name is Jennifer Hayes, and I work for the Vermont Department of Children and Families. I'm calling about some records that have recently come to light regarding your adoption. Would it be possible for us to meet in person to discuss this?" Marcus felt his stomach drop in the way it did when he sensed that his comfortable world was about to be disrupted. "What kind of records? Is there some problem with my adoption?" "Not a problem exactly, but we've discovered some discrepancies in your file that we think you should be aware of. The documents we have don't match the story you may have been told about your background. Would tomorrow afternoon work for you to come in?" The meeting at the Department of Children and Families lasted 3 hours, and left Marcus feeling as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted permanently. Jennifer Hayes, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who clearly dealt with difficult revelations as part of her regular job, had spread his file across the conference table like pieces of a puzzle that had never quite fit together properly. The truth, as she explained it, was both simpler and more complicated than the story he had grown up believing. Marcus had not been orphaned by a car accident. Instead, he had been brought to Vermont in July 1998 by a woman named Margaret Torres, who had claimed to be his aunt and legal guardian. The paperwork had been processed quickly and with less scrutiny than would be standard today, and Margaret had placed him with the Wellington family within a week of their arrival in Burlington. Margaret Torres had disappeared shortly after the placement was finalized, leaving behind a post office box that was never renewed, and a phone number that was disconnected within a month. The Wellingtons, who had been on the adoption waiting list for 3 years, had been told that the birth family preferred a closed adoption and wanted no further contact. Everyone had been satisfied with the arrangement, and Marcus had grown up as Marcus Wellington, with no knowledge of his origins beyond the carefully constructed story about the car accident and the deceased parents who had never existed. "The problem," Jennifer Hayes explained, "is that we've now discovered that Margaret Torres was wanted for questioning in connection with the disappearance of a child in Iowa in 1998. The FBI contacted us last month as part of a cold case review, and when we cross-referenced our records, your case file raised several red flags. Marcus stared at the documents spread before him, birth certificates and court orders and photographs of people he didn't recognize. One photo in particular caught his attention, a woman in her 40s with dark hair and kind eyes, holding a small boy who looked about 7 years old. The boy had Marcus's dark hair and the same stubborn set to his jaw that Marcus saw in the mirror every morning. The child who disappeared was named Michael Torres. Jennifer continued gently. He was 7 years old when he vanished from Cedar Falls, Iowa on July 15, 1998. His mother's name was Elena Torres, and his father was David Torres. Margaret Torres was Elena's sister-in-law, David's sister, and she was one of the last people to see Michael before he disappeared. The room seemed to tilt around Marcus as he processed what he was being told. Are you saying that I'm this missing child? That I'm Michael Torres? We can't be certain without DNA testing, but the timeline matches, and there are other indicators that suggest this possibility. The FBI would like to speak with you, and they've asked if you would be willing to provide a DNA sample for a comparison with the Torres family. Marcus left the meeting with his head spinning, and a manila envelope full of photocopied documents that told the story of a family he might have belonged to and a life he might have lived. The drive home through Burlington's familiar streets felt surreal, as though he was seeing his own city through the eyes of a stranger. Every landmark that had been part of his personal geography, the coffee shop where he spent mornings working, the park where he jogged, the music store where he bought equipment, seemed to exist in a different reality than the one he was inhabiting now. That night, he called his adoptive parents and told them about the meeting. Robert and Catherine Wellington listened with the same calm attention they had always brought to their son's problems, asking thoughtful questions and offering to support him in whatever way he needed. They had always known that this day might come, they explained, though they had hoped the sealed records would stay sealed forever. They had loved him as their son for 28 years, and that love wasn't diminished by questions about his origins. "You're our son, Marcus," Catherine said over the phone, her voice steady despite what he could hear were tears. "You always will be, no matter what these tests show. But if there's another family out there who has been wondering about you all these years, then maybe it's time to find out the truth." Marcus spent the weekend reading everything he could find online about the disappearance of Michael Torres. The newspaper archives painted a picture of a close-knit community, devastated by the unexplained loss of a beloved child. He studied photographs of Elena and David Torres, looking for resemblances to his own features, reading quotes from Elena about never giving up hope that her son would come home someday. The most difficult part was looking at school photos of Michael Torres at age 7 and seeing what might have been his own face staring back at him. The boy in the pictures had the same dark eyes, the same crooked smile, the same cowlick that made his hair stick up on the left side no matter how much it was combed down. Marcus had always wondered where that stubborn cowlick had come from. On Monday morning, he called the FBI and agreed to provide a DNA sample. The process was simple and clinical, a cheek swab that took 30 seconds and would take 3 weeks to analyze. Agent Patricia Morrison, who had taken over the case from a retired colleague, explained that even if the DNA confirmed his identity as Michael Torres, it wouldn't necessarily solve the mystery of how he had ended up in Vermont or what had happened during those missing weeks in the summer of 1998. The waiting was torture. Marcus tried to maintain his normal routine, but he found himself distracted and unable to concentrate on his work. He started having dreams about Iowa. Not memories, exactly, but vivid imaginings of cornfields and grain elevators and small houses with screened porches. He began paying attention to his own habits and preferences, wondering which traits might have come from his biological parents and which were products of his upbringing with the Wellingtons. 3 weeks later, Agent Morrison called with the results that would change his life forever. "Marcus," she said, "the DNA test confirms it. You are Michael Torres." The confirmation that Marcus Wellington was indeed Michael Torres arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt eerily similar to that July day 25 years earlier when a 7-year-old boy had vanished from Cedar Falls. Marcus received the call from Agent Morrison while he was sitting at his kitchen table, drinking coffee from a mug his adoptive mother had given him for his birthday, watching the October rain streak down the windows of his Burlington apartment. "The DNA is a definitive match," Agent Morrison said, her voice professionally gentle. "You are Michael Torres. I've already spoken with Elena Torres in Iowa to let her know. She's asked me to give you her phone number, but there's no pressure to contact her until you're ready." Marcus wrote down his birth mother's phone number with hands that shook slightly, staring at the digits as if they were a code that might unlock 25 years of missing memories. Elena Torres. The name felt foreign on his tongue when he whispered it aloud, though something deep in his chest recognized the sound of it, like an echo from a dream he could almost remember. The next few days passed in a strange suspension of normal time. Marcus called in sick to his current project, unable to concentrate on composing music when his entire understanding of himself had been rewritten overnight. He walked through Burlington's familiar streets like a tourist in his own life, studying his reflection in shop windows and wondering which features came from David Torres and which from Elena, seeing himself clearly for the first time as the child of people whose faces he had studied in old newspaper photographs. The Wellingtons drove up from their home near Lake Champlain that evening, bringing Chinese takeout and the same steady presence they had provided throughout his childhood. They sat in his living room among the keyboards and recording equipment, talking about the practical and emotional implications of his discovery with the same thoughtful consideration they had always brought to family decisions. "You need to call her," Catherine said gently, referring to Elena Torres. "Not because you owe her anything, but because she's spent 25 years wondering if you were alive. Whatever happens next, she deserves to know that you're safe and well." Robert nodded, his architect's mind already working through the logistics of what would come next. "This is going to be complicated, son. There are legal questions about Margaret Torres and what she did, media attention once this gets out, and emotional landmines everywhere you step. But you don't have to navigate this alone." Marcus appreciated their support, but he also understood that this was a journey he would ultimately have to take by himself. The Wellingtons would always be his parents, but Elena Torres was the woman who had given birth to him, who had searched for him, who had kept his bedroom unchanged for 25 years in case he came home. That night, he called Elena Torres. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered, tentative and hopeful. "Hello? Mrs. Torres? This is Marcus Wellington," Agent Morrison said. "She gave you my number." There was a sharp intake of breath and silence that stretched long enough for Marcus to wonder if the call had been disconnected. When Elena spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. "Michael? Is it really you?" The name hit him like a physical blow. No one had called him Michael since he was 4 years old, but hearing it in his birth, Mother's voice stirred something buried so deep in his memory that it felt more like déjà vu than actual recollection. "I think so," he said, surprised by the emotion in his own voice. "The DNA test says I am, but I don't remember. I don't have any clear memories of before I was 4. "You were 7 when you disappeared," Elena said, and he could hear her struggling to keep her composure. "You had just learned to ride a bike without training wheels. You loved baseball cards and model airplanes and, oh, Michael, I've thought about you every single day for 25 years. They talked for over an hour that first night, Elena sharing memories of his childhood while Marcus listened for any spark of recognition. She told him about the red bicycle he had loved, about Mrs. Henderson next door who had treated him like her own grandson, about the model airplane he and his father had been building in the garage. None of it triggered clear memories, but there were moments when her descriptions felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain. "Your Aunt Margaret," Elena said, her voice hardening slightly. "She came to visit a few weeks before you disappeared. She said she wanted to spend time with family, but she seemed different, nervous. She kept asking questions about your schedule, about when your father and I would be at work." Marcus felt a chill of recognition at the mention of Margaret Torres. He had no clear memory of her face, but something about the name felt dangerous, like a shadow at the edge of his vision. "The police think she took you," Elena continued. "They never found her, never figured out how she did it or why. One day you were here, and then you were gone, and she disappeared at the same time." Over the following weeks, Marcus began the delicate process of reconstructing his identity. Agent Morrison shared what the FBI had learned about Margaret Torres over the years. A woman with a history of mental instability, financial problems, and an obsession with her nephew that had grown concerning in the months before Michael's disappearance. She had apparently been planning the abduction for some time, creating false documents and researching adoption procedures in Vermont before making her move. The psychological evaluation Agent Morrison arranged revealed that Marcus's lack of early memories was consistent with both the trauma of being separated from his family and the common phenomenon of childhood amnesia. Most people retain few clear memories from before age 4 or 5, and the additional stress of his circumstances would have made it even more likely that his early life would be lost to conscious recollection. But the memories weren't entirely gone, the psychologist explained. They were buried in his subconscious, influencing his personality and preferences in ways he might not recognize. His love of music, for instance, might have roots in the lullabies his birth mother had sung to him. His preference for certain foods or his comfort with small-town environments might be echoes of his early childhood in Cedar Falls. Marcus found himself studying his own habits and preferences with new interest. He had always been drawn to folk music and simple melodies, despite his classical training. He preferred modest homes to grand ones, found comfort in routine and predictability, and had an inexplicable fondness for the smell of fresh-baked cookies that he now realized might be connected to Elena's tradition of baking chocolate chip cookies every Tuesday. The decision to visit Cedar Falls came gradually, built from weeks of phone conversations with Elena, and a growing need to see the place where his life had begun. Elena had been patient, never pushing him to come home. She was careful never to use that word, understanding that Burlington was home to him now, but he could hear the hope in her voice every time they spoke. David Torres had remarried, and was more cautious about the reunion. Through Elena, he had expressed his joy at learning Michael was alive and well, but he had also requested time to process this development before meeting his son face to face. Marcus understood this hesitation. After all, David had spent 25 years learning to live with loss, and hope could be more frightening than grief when you had built your life around its absence. The media attention had been intense, but manageable, thanks to Agent Morrison's careful handling of the information release. The story of Michael Torres's return had made national news, but the family had requested privacy, and most reporters had respected their wishes. There had been interview requests from major networks and true crime podcasts, but Marcus had declined them all, wanting to understand his own story before sharing it with the world. As November approached, Marcus made plans to visit Cedar Falls for the first time since he was 7 years old. Elena had offered to let him stay in his childhood bedroom, which she had preserved exactly as he had left it, but Marcus had gently requested a hotel room instead. The gesture was kind, but the thought of sleeping in a shrine to his lost childhood felt overwhelming. The flight from Burlington to Cedar Rapids was short, but it felt like traveling between different worlds. Marcus pressed his face to the airplane window as they descended over Iowa, studying the geometric patterns of farmland that stretched to the horizon. Something about the landscape felt familiar, though he couldn't tell if that was actual memory or simply the power of suggestion. Elena met him at the airport, and Marcus recognized her immediately, despite the 25 years that had passed. She was smaller than he had expected, her dark hair now streaked with silver, but her eyes were exactly as they had appeared in the photographs he had studied. She approached him hesitantly, as if afraid he might disappear again if she moved too quickly. "Michael," she whispered, and then she was hugging him, and Marcus found himself hugging her back with an intensity that surprised him. She smelled like vanilla and lavender, scents that triggered something deep in his memory that felt like safety and warmth. The drive to Cedar Falls took 45 minutes, winding through small towns and past farmhouses that Elena pointed out as landmarks from his childhood. She told stories as she drove, about the ice cream stand where she had taken him every Friday in the summer, about the library where they had checked out stacks of picture books, about the park with the old wooden playground where he had learned to swing by himself. Cedar Falls was smaller than Marcus had imagined, the kind of place where the main street still had diagonal parking and the grain elevator dominated the skyline. Elena drove slowly through the residential neighborhoods, pointing out houses where his friends had lived, the school he would have attended, the Methodist church where his parents had been married. The house on Maple Street looked exactly as it had in the photographs Elena had emailed him, a modest ranch with a screened porch and a yard dominated by the stump of what had once been a massive oak tree. Elena parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel. "I've imagined this moment for 25 years, she said quietly. "I thought I would know what to say, but now that you're here, I don't have words for it." They walked through the house together, Elena narrating each room like a tour guide in a museum of memory. The living room where he had built blanket forts, the kitchen where he had eaten breakfast every morning, the hallway where his height had been marked on the doorframe in pencil, marks that stopped abruptly at the measurement taken 3 weeks before his disappearance. His bedroom was the most difficult room to enter. Elena opened the door carefully, as if afraid the spell that had preserved it might be broken by too sudden a movement. The room was exactly as a 7-year-old boy had left it. Unmade bed with Batman sheets, Hot Wheels cars lined up on the dresser, model airplane kits stacked on the bookshelf, waiting to be built. Marcus stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying the artifacts of a childhood he couldn't remember. Something about the arrangement of the room felt right, as if his hands had known exactly where to place each toy, each book, each piece of the carefully ordered world he had created in this small space. "You always kept your room neat," Elena said softly. "Even at 7, you liked everything in its place. Your father said you got that from me." It was then that Marcus noticed the music box sitting on the nightstand beside the bed. It was small and delicate, made of polished wood with intricate carvings around the edges. Elena saw him looking at it and smiled for the first time since he had arrived. "That was my grandmother's," she said. "She gave it to me when I was about your age, and I gave it to you when you turned 6. You used to wind it up every night before bed. It plays, for Elise. You said it helped you have good dreams." Marcus reached for the music box without thinking, his fingers finding the small key on the bottom, as if they had done this same motion 1,000 times before. He wound it carefully and opened the lid, and the familiar melody of Beethoven's Für Elise began to play, each note crystalline and pure in the silence of the preserved bedroom. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. As the first few bars of the lullaby filled the room, something deep in Marcus's mind cracked open like an egg, releasing a flood of memories that had been locked away for 25 years. Suddenly he could see himself as a 7-year-old boy, sitting on the edge of this same bed, winding this same music box as the last light of summer evening filtered through the window. He remembered Elena's voice, singing along with the melody as she tucked him in, remembered the weight of the quilt his grandmother had made, remembered the sound of his father's voice drifting in from the garage, where he worked on projects late into the evening. But more than that, he remembered the morning he had disappeared. Not all of it, but crucial fragments that had been buried beneath decades of forgetting. The melody of Für Elise continued to play from the antique music box, each note acting like a key turning in the lock of Marcus's buried memories. He sank onto the edge of the bed where he had slept as Michael Torres, the Batman sheets beneath him, suddenly as familiar as his own skin. Elena stood in the doorway, watching with a mixture of hope and fear, as 25 years of carefully constructed amnesia began to crumble. "I remember," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I remember this room. I remember winding the music box every night." He looked up at Elena with eyes that were suddenly those of her 7-year-old son. "I remember you singing to me." The memories came in fragments at first, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle scattered by time and trauma. Marcus could see himself eating breakfast at the kitchen table while Elena packed his lunch, could feel the weight of his backpack as he prepared to ride his bicycle to Tommy Patterson's house. He remembered the red Huffy with the banana seat, remembered the way the chain sometimes slipped when he pedaled too hard up the hill by the Methodist church. But the clearest memory, the one that emerged with startling clarity as the music box wound down to silence, was of that final morning in July 1998. He could see himself in the garage with his father, working on the model airplane that had become their special project. David had been showing him how to attach the tissue paper to the wing frame, his large hands guiding Michael's smaller ones as they applied the delicate covering. "Your Aunt Margaret is coming to visit today," Elena had called from the kitchen doorway. "She should be here around lunchtime." Michael remembered feeling confused by this announcement. He had met Aunt Margaret only a few times, and something about her had always made him uncomfortable. She stared at him too intently, asked too many questions about his friends and his schedule, and hugged him longer than felt natural. His mother had always been polite to Margaret, but Michael had sensed an underlying tension whenever David's sister came around. "Why is she coming?" 7-year-old Michael had asked his father. David had frowned slightly, the same expression Marcus now recognized in his own face, when he was concentrating on a difficult piece of music. "She says she wants to spend time with family. Sometimes grown-ups go through hard times and need to be around people they love." The morning had proceeded normally after that. Michael had eaten his breakfast, kissed his mother goodbye, and ridden his bicycle toward downtown Cedar Falls, with plans to meet Tommy at the park and then go to the creek behind the Methodist church to look for crawdads. It had been a perfect summer morning, the kind that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead with possibilities for adventure. But Margaret Torres had arrived earlier than expected. Marcus closed his eyes, letting the recovered memory play out in vivid detail. He had been riding his bicycle past the Hendersons' house when he had seen Margaret's car parked in their driveway. Something about seeing her there, 3 hours before she was supposed to arrive, had filled him with unease. He had turned his bicycle around and pedaled back toward home, planning to tell his mother that Aunt Margaret was already in town. He had found Margaret in their kitchen, talking quietly with Elena. Both women had looked up when he burst through the screen door, and Michael had immediately sensed that something was wrong. His mother's face was pale, and Margaret was holding a piece of paper that she quickly folded and put in her purse when she saw him. "Michael, honey," Elena had said, her voice strained in a way that meant she was trying to hide something from him. "Aunt Margaret has some news about your grandparents. She needs to take you to see them right away." This had confused Michael deeply. His grandparents lived in Des Moines, only 2 hours away, and they had just visited the month before. Why would he need to go see them suddenly? And why did his mother look like she might cry? "I don't want to go," he had said, the way children do when they sense danger but can't articulate their fears. "I want to stay here and play with Tommy." Margaret had knelt down in front of him, her hands gripping his shoulders more tightly than necessary. "This is very important, Michael. Your grandparents are sick, and they want to see you before they can't see you anymore." Even at 7, Michael had known this was a lie. His grandparents had been healthy and active when he had seen them just weeks earlier. But Margaret's grip on his shoulders was painful, and his mother was standing behind her with tears in her eyes, nodding slowly, as if agreeing to something terrible. "It's okay, sweetheart," Elena had said, though her voice suggested it was anything but okay. "Aunt Margaret will take good care of you. You'll only be gone for a few days." The next part of the memory was fragmented and confused, like trying to remember a nightmare upon waking. Margaret had insisted they leave immediately, not even allowing Michael to pack a bag or say goodbye to his father. She had loaded him into her car, a dark blue sedan that smelled like cigarettes and air freshener, and had driven away from Cedar Falls while he pressed his face against the back window, watching his house disappear behind them. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at Elena, who was now sitting beside him on the bed, tears streaming down her face as she watched him piece together the memories she had probably hoped he would never recover. "She lied to you," he said quietly, "about my grandparents being sick. That's why you let her take me." Elena nodded, her voice barely a whisper. She had documents, papers that looked official, saying there was a family emergency and that she had been granted temporary custody. "I didn't understand why David hadn't told me about it, but the papers looked real, and she was family." Elena's voice broke. "I should have called your father. I should have questioned it more. But she said there wasn't time, that every minute mattered." Marcus reached for his birth mother's hand, understanding now the impossible position Margaret had put her in. She planned it. She knew exactly what to say to make you trust her. The drive with Margaret was mostly a blur in his recovered memory, but Marcus could recall fragments of the journey, stopping at gas stations where Margaret wouldn't let him out of her sight, staying in cheap motels where she made him promise not to talk to strangers, the gradual realization that they weren't going to see his grandparents at all. Somewhere in Missouri, Margaret had cut his hair short and dyed it blonde. She had made him practice saying his name was Matthew Torres, that she was his mother, that his father had died in an accident. She had bought him new clothes and thrown away everything he had been wearing when she took him from Cedar Falls, including the small plastic dinosaur he had carried in his pocket, a toy he had forgotten about until this moment. "I cried for you," Marcus said, the memory of that desperate longing washing over him like a wave. "Every night, for weeks, I cried because I wanted to come home. But she kept telling me that you and Dad had died, that she was the only family I had left." The psychological manipulation had been sophisticated and cruel. Margaret had isolated him completely, moving them frequently and never staying anywhere long enough for him to form connections with other people. She had convinced him that his memories of Elena and David were fantasies, that the life he remembered in Cedar Falls had been a dream he had created to cope with the trauma of losing his parents. By the time they reached Vermont, Marcus could barely remember his real name. The trauma of being separated from his family, combined with Margaret's systematic gaslighting, had fragmented his sense of identity so completely that when she handed him over to the Wellington family, he had genuinely believed the story she had constructed about being an orphan child in need of a loving home. "Where is she now?" Marcus asked. "Margaret, I mean. Did they ever find her?" Elena shook her head. "She disappeared completely after she placed you with the Wellingtons. The FBI has been looking for her for 25 years, but it's like she vanished from the face of the earth. Agent Morrison thinks she might have changed her identity and started a new life somewhere else." Marcus wound the music box again, needing to hear the melody that had unlocked his memories. As Fur-Elise played once more, he could see his 7-year-old self clearly. A boy who had loved model airplanes and baseball cards, who had felt safe and loved in this small house on Maple Street, who had never imagined that trust could be weaponized or that family could become a source of betrayal. "I'm sorry," he said to Elena, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was apologizing for being taken, for not remembering, for growing up as someone else's son, for all the years she had spent wondering if he was alive. "You have nothing to be sorry for," Elena said firmly, her hand squeezing his. "You were a child. None of this was your fault. The important thing is that you're home now." But even as she said it, Marcus knew that the concept of home had become complicated for him. Cedar Falls was where he had been born, where his biological family lived, where his story had begun. But Burlington was where he had grown up, where he had become the man he was now, where the family who had raised him still lived and loved him. He was caught between two identities, two histories, two definitions of belonging that might never fully reconcile. The music box wound down to silence again, and Marcus carefully closed the lid. The memories were still there, clear and painful and real, but they felt like they belonged to someone else. A 7-year-old boy named Michael Torres, who had vanished on a summer morning 25 years ago and would never truly come home again. The weeks following Marcus's return to Burlington were filled with phone calls from Elena that came at carefully scheduled times, respecting the boundaries he had needed to establish after the overwhelming intensity of his visit to Cedar Falls. Each conversation was a delicate navigation between the woman who had given birth to him and the man who had grown up as someone else's son, both of them learning to relate to each other across the vast gulf of 25 lost years. Marcus found himself caught between two gravitational pulls that seemed impossible to reconcile. In Vermont, he was Marcus Wellington, successful composer, beloved son of Robert and Catherine, a man whose life made sense in linear progression from childhood to adulthood. In Iowa, he was Michael Torres, the lost boy whose disappearance had frozen a family in time, whose return had rewritten their understanding of grief and hope, and the possibility of miracles. The psychological impact of recovering his early memories had been more profound than Marcus had anticipated. Dr. Sarah Chen, the therapist he had started seeing after returning from Cedar Falls, explained that his experience was similar to that of trauma survivors who recover suppressed memories after decades of amnesia. The brain, she said, sometimes protects itself by burying experiences too painful to process, but when those memories surface, they bring with them all the emotional weight they carried when they were first formed. Marcus found himself grieving for losses he had never known he had experienced. He mourned the relationship with his biological father that had been interrupted when he was 7, the friendship with Tommy Patterson that had ended mid-conversation, the model airplane he and David Torres had never finished building together. These were sorrows that belonged to Michael Torres, but they lived now in the heart of Marcus Wellington, creating a strange doubling of identity that left him feeling like two people inhabiting the same body. The media attention, despite Agent Morrison's efforts to control it, had been relentless. The story of the missing boy who had been found 25 years later had captured the public imagination in ways that made Marcus deeply uncomfortable. Producers from major networks called regularly with offers for exclusive interviews. True crime podcasters wanted to explore every detail of Margaret Torres's deception. Publishers had approached him about writing a memoir that would undoubtedly become a bestseller. Marcus had declined them all, but the attention had still managed to disrupt his carefully ordered life. Strangers recognized him on the street in Burlington, approaching with sympathetic expressions and invasive questions about how it felt to discover his true identity. His neighbors in the arts district treated him differently now, with a mixture of fascination and pity that made him feel like a curiosity rather than a person. The Wellingtons had handled the revelation with the same grace they had brought to every other crisis in Marcus's life, but he could see the strain in their faces when they thought he wasn't looking. Catherine had started mentioning Elena Torres more frequently in conversation, asking about their phone calls and whether Marcus was planning another visit to Iowa. Robert had become quietly protective, screening calls and deflecting questions from reporters who still occasionally showed up at their door. "We know you love us," Catherine had said during one of their weekly dinners, "and we know we'll always be your parents. But Elena Torres has been waiting 25 years to have her son back, and you need to figure out what that means for your life now." The question of what his discovery meant for his relationship with Elena had become the central puzzle of Marcus's existence. She had been patient and understanding, never pushing him to visit again or to commit to any particular vision of their future relationship. but he could hear the hope in her voice during their phone calls, the careful way she mentioned family traditions or local events, as if testing whether he might be interested in being part of them again. David Torres had finally agreed to meet him during his second visit to Cedar Falls in December. The encounter had been awkward and emotional, two men trying to find common ground across a quarter-century of absence. David was remarried now, with stepchildren who were older than Michael had been when he disappeared. He had built a new life on the foundation of his grief, and Marcus's return had shaken that foundation in ways that were both wonderful and terrifying. "I used to imagine what you would look like grown up," David had said during their stilted lunch at a restaurant on Cedar Falls' Main Street. "I pictured teaching you to drive, helping you with homework, walking you down the aisle at your wedding. But you're 32 now, and you don't need me to teach you anything. You became a man without me." The pain in his biological father's voice had been almost unbearable. Marcus had wanted to comfort him, to bridge the gap between them, but the truth was that David Torres was essentially a stranger to him. The connection he felt was intellectual, rather than emotional. The recognition that this man had helped create him, had loved the 7-year-old boy he had been, but had not been part of shaping the adult he had become. Christmas had been particularly complicated. The Wellingtons had invited Elena to spend the holiday with them in Vermont, a gesture of incredible generosity that had left all of them feeling awkward and unsure of their roles. Elena had declined the invitation, saying she understood that Marcus needed time to process everything without feeling pulled between his two families, but Marcus knew the decision had cost her. He had spent Christmas Day trying to be present for the family traditions that had anchored his life for 28 years, but part of his mind had been in Cedar Falls, wondering how Elena was spending the holiday in the house where she had been waiting for him to come home for 25 years. The guilt of being loved by multiple families, of having more than most people could ever hope for, felt almost as heavy as the trauma of his original loss. The investigation into Margaret Torres had continued through the winter, but Agent Morrison had warned Marcus not to expect closure. Margaret had vanished so completely that she might be dead, might have created a new identity, might be living anonymously in any city in America. The likelihood of finding her after 25 years was minimal, and even if they did locate her, the trauma of confronting the woman who had destroyed his childhood might be more harmful than healing. "Some questions don't have answers," Dr. Chen had said during one of their sessions. "The healing comes not from understanding why something happened, but from learning to live with the fact that it did happen and that you survived it." By February, Marcus had made a decision that surprised even him. He had arranged to spend a month in Cedar Falls, renting a small apartment downtown and taking a break from his composing work to explore the possibility of dividing his time between Vermont and Iowa. It wasn't a permanent move. He wasn't ready for anything that dramatic, but it was an experiment in belonging to two places at once. The month in Cedar Falls had been revelatory in ways both positive and difficult. He had walked the streets where he had ridden his bicycle as a child, visited the creek where he had hunted for crawdads, stood in the cemetery where Mrs. Henderson was buried. Some of these experiences had triggered additional memories, brief flashes of recognition that helped fill in the gaps of his early childhood. But he had also struggled with the weight of expectation that seemed to follow him everywhere in the small town. People who had known him as a child approached him with eager faces, wanting to share their memories of little Michael Torres and hoping to see some recognition in his eyes. The local newspaper had run a feature story about his return, and suddenly everyone in Cedar Falls felt they had a relationship with his story. Elena had been wonderful during that month, giving him space to explore his feelings about the town while making herself available whenever he needed to talk. They had developed a routine of having coffee together twice a week, during which she would share stories about his childhood or updates about extended family members he couldn't remember. These conversations had been healing for both of them, creating new memories that belonged to both Michael Torres and Marcus Wellington. The most significant development had come near the end of his month-long stay, when Elena had asked him to help her clear out the garage where his father had worked on the model airplane. David had finally decided to donate his tools and give up the space, and Elena thought Marcus might want to keep some of the projects they had worked on together. Among the dusty boxes and forgotten tools, they had found the model airplane that 7-year-old Michael and his father had been building together. The tissue paper wings were yellowed with age, and the delicate balsa wood frame had warped slightly over the years, but the airplane was exactly as they had left it on that July morning in 1998. David had apparently been unable to touch it for 25 years, leaving it on the workbench like a shrine to interrupted time. Marcus had held the fragile model in his hands, feeling the weight of a shared project that had been abandoned when childhood ended too abruptly. In that moment, standing in the garage, where he had learned to use tools and had spent precious time with his father, he had finally understood that healing didn't require choosing between his two lives. It required finding a way to honor both of them. The decision to complete the model airplane had come to Marcus in the quiet moments of dawn, as he sat in his rented apartment in Cedar Falls, watching the sun rise over the grain elevator that still dominated the town's skyline. He had been holding the delicate balsa wood frame, studying the places where 7-year-old Michael's fingerprints were still visible in dried glue, when he realized that finishing what he and David Torres had started might be the bridge he needed between his two identities. He had called David that morning, nervous about reaching out but determined to try. David's voice had been cautious at first, still uncertain about how to navigate this relationship with the grown man who had once been his little boy. But when Marcus explained what he wanted to do, the enthusiasm had been immediate and profound. "I've thought about that airplane every day for 25 years, David had said, his voice thick with emotion. "I could never bring myself to finish it without you, but I could never throw it away either." They had met in the garage that afternoon, two men separated by decades of loss but connected by the simple desire to complete something beautiful together. David's hands were more weathered now, marked by years of working on engines and farm equipment, but they were still steady as he showed Marcus how to attach the tissue paper covering to the wing frame. Marcus's hands were softer, shaped by years of playing piano and working with delicate recording equipment, but they remembered the basic movements David had taught him when he was 7. Working on the airplane had been a form of meditation, a way of being present with each other without the weight of trying to reconstruct 25 years of missed conversations. David talked about the changes in aircraft design since 1998, about the projects he had worked on in the years after Marcus's disappearance, about the satisfaction of building something with your hands that could actually fly. Marcus shared stories about his life in Vermont, about the music he composed and the family who had raised him, about the ways his early love of building things had evolved into creating melodies and harmonies. As they worked, other family members had begun to join them. Elena would bring them coffee and sandwiches, sometimes staying to watch as they carefully glued pieces into place. David's stepchildren, curious about the half-brother they had never known existed, had dropped by to observe the project that seemed to fascinate the adults in their lives. Even some of the neighbors who remembered Michael as a child had found excuses to visit, drawn by the symbolic power of a father and son completing a project that had been interrupted by tragedy. The airplane had taken 3 weeks to finish, working together for a few hours each evening after David's shift at his auto repair shop. When they finally attached the propeller and applied the last piece of tissue paper to the fuselage, both men had stood back and stared at their creation, with the satisfaction that comes from seeing something through to completion, despite impossible obstacles. "She's beautiful," David had said, his voice filled with the pride that had been waiting 25 years to express itself. "Your mother always said you had good hands for delicate work." The model airplane was indeed beautiful, a perfect replica of a World War II fighter plane, painted in olive green and silver with authentic military markings that David had researched meticulously. It was the kind of project that required patience, attention to detail, and the ability to work together toward a common goal, all skills that Marcus realized he had learned during those early years with David and had carried with him into his adult life without understanding their origin. They had decided to test fly the airplane on a Saturday morning in April, when the Iowa wind was calm and the spring air was crisp with possibility. Elena had packed a picnic lunch, and they had driven to the park where Michael had played as a child, the same park where search parties had gathered during those terrible weeks in 1998. The symbolism was not lost on any of them, returning to the place where so much grief had been concentrated to celebrate something joyful and completed. David had shown Marcus how to wind the rubber band motor, explaining the physics of lift and thrust in the same patient voice he had used when Michael was 7. Marcus had held the airplane carefully, feeling the weight of shared history in its delicate frame, understanding that this moment was about more than aerodynamics or childhood hobbies. When he released the airplane, it had soared into the clear April sky with a grace that took their breath away. The model had climbed higher than any of them had expected, its wings catching the sunlight as it traced lazy circles above the park where a little boy had once played before disappearing into mystery. For those moments while the airplane danced above them, Marcus had felt a complete integration of his two selves, the boy who had dreamed of flying, and the man who had learned to create beauty with his hands and heart. The airplane had eventually glided to a gentle landing in the grass near the creek, where Michael had once hunted for crawdads. As they walked together to retrieve it, Marcus had realized that this was what healing looked like. Not the erasure of loss or the magical restoration of time, but the patient work of building new connections while honoring what had been broken. Over the months that followed, Marcus had developed a routine that allowed him to maintain relationships with both his families. He spent half his time in Burlington, composing music and maintaining the life he had built as Marcus Wellington, and half his time in Cedar Falls, slowly building new memories with Elena and David, while exploring the town where his story had begun. It wasn't a perfect solution. There were still moments of confusion and sadness, times when he felt like he was living in translation between two languages of belonging, but it was a life that honored both versions of himself. The Wellingtons had been remarkably supportive of this arrangement, understanding that their son's happiness required him to explore all the connections that made him who he was. Catherine had started corresponding with Elena, sharing stories about Marcus's childhood and comparing notes about his preferences and personality traits. Robert had visited Cedar Falls twice, bringing his architect's eye to help Elena plan some renovations to her house, and finding unexpected common ground with David over their shared love of working with their hands. Elena had flourished during this period of reconnection, the long years of frozen grief finally beginning to thaw into something more hopeful. She had started volunteering at the library again, had renewed friendships that had been neglected during the worst years of her mourning, and had even begun talking about the possibility of traveling to places she had always wanted to see. Marcus's return hadn't erased the 25 years of loss, but it had given her permission to imagine a future that included joy as well as memory. The investigation into Margaret Torres had finally reached a conclusion of sorts, when Agent Morrison had called with news that DNA evidence had linked her to a woman who had died in a car accident in Oregon in 2003. Margaret had been living under an assumed name, working as a nurse in a small coastal town, and had apparently never committed any other crimes after placing Marcus with the Wellington family. The news had been both relief and disappointment. Relief that she was no longer a threat to anyone. Disappointment that there would never be answers to the questions that still haunted the edges of Marcus's recovered memories. Sometimes the best justice is simply surviving and thriving despite what someone tried to take from you. Dr. Chin had said when Marcus shared the news about Margaret's death, "You became a good man, you maintained connections with people who love you, and you found your way back to your origins while keeping the gifts your adoptive family gave you. That's a remarkable outcome from a terrible beginning." As the second anniversary of his rediscovery approached, Marcus had been working on a piece of music that incorporated the melody from the music box that had triggered his memories. Fur Elise had become the foundation for a larger composition that wove together themes representing both his families, both his identities, both the loss and the finding that had shaped his life. The piece was complex and layered, requiring both classical training and intuitive understanding of how melodies could carry emotional weight across time. He had premiered the composition at a small concert in Burlington, with both his families in attendance. Elena and David had sat in the front row beside Robert and Catherine, four people who had loved the same person in different ways and at different times, united now by their shared investment in his happiness. As Marcus played the intricate piece that told the story of his life through music, he had seen tears in all their eyes, tears of loss and gratitude, and the complex emotions that arise when broken things are mended, not by returning to their original form, but by becoming something entirely new. The applause that followed had been warm and sustained, but the moment that mattered most had come afterward, when Elena had approached the piano where Marcus still sat. She had wound the small music box she had brought from Cedar Falls and set it on the piano bench beside him. "This belongs with you now," she had said simply. "Wherever home is for you, this should be there too." As the familiar melody of Fur Elise played from the antique music box, Marcus had understood that home was not a place, but a collection of relationships, memories, and connections that could expand to include multiple locations and identities. He was Marcus Wellington and Michael Torres, son of the Wellingtons and son of Elena and David, a man whose life had been broken and mended in ways that made him stronger and more compassionate than he might have been if tragedy had never touched his family. The music box wound down to silence, and Marcus closed the lid gently. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the people who had shaped him and loved him and waited for him, He finally understood that some stories don't end with answers or closure or the restoration of what was lost. Sometimes they end with the deeper truth that love persists across time and distance and even the cruelest disruptions, and that the melodies we carry in our hearts continue to play long after the music box stops turning. He looked out at the faces in the small concert hall, neighbors and friends, and the two families who had given him different versions of the same unconditional love, and knew that Michael Torres had indeed come home. Not to a single place or a simple identity, but to the recognition that belonging is large enough to hold multiple truths, and that sometimes being found means discovering you were never truly lost at all. The evening ended with dinner at the Wellingtons' house, where Elena helped Catherine prepare a meal that included dishes from both families' traditions. David and Robert worked together to assemble a new workbench in the garage, already planning projects they might build together. Marcus sat at the kitchen table where he had eaten thousands of meals as Marcus Wellington, watching his biological mother and adoptive mother work side by side, and marveled at how love could expand to accommodate even the most complicated circumstances. As the months passed, Marcus found himself settling into a rhythm that felt sustainable and authentic. He spent summers in Cedar Falls, where the heat and humidity triggered memories of childhood adventures, and the slower pace allowed him to explore his connection to the place where his story had begun. Winters found him in Burlington, where the snow-covered mountains and familiar creative community provided the solitude and inspiration he needed for his musical work. The town of Cedar Falls had gradually adjusted to his presence, no longer treating him as a curiosity, but accepting him as Elena Torres' son, who had come home in an unconventional way. He had started teaching piano lessons at the community center, sharing his musical gifts with a new generation of children who saw him simply as Mr. Marcus, the patient teacher who could make even difficult pieces seem manageable. These children knew nothing of his history, and their acceptance was healing in ways he hadn't expected. Elena had started dating again, a widower named Frank who owned the hardware store and treated her with the gentle kindness of someone who understood loss. Marcus had been surprised by how happy this development made him, realizing that his mother's healing was as important to him as his own. Frank was kind to Marcus without trying too hard to be a father figure, understanding instinctively that some relationships couldn't be rushed or forced into familiar categories. David had grandchildren now through his stepchildren, and Marcus had slowly found his place in this extended family as the uncle who lived far away but sent thoughtful gifts and remembered birthdays. The relationship with David would never be what it might have been if Michael Torres had grown up in Cedar Falls, but it had become something valuable in its own rights, a connection based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than the uncomplicated love between a father and his young son. The model airplane they had completed together hung in David's shop, a reminder of what could be accomplished when people were willing to work patiently toward a common goal, despite the obstacles that separated them. Customers often asked about it, and David would tell the story of the son who had come home after 25 years to finish a project they had started when the boy was 7. These retellings had become part of Cedar Falls folklore, a story that gave people hope about the possibility of healing and reconciliation, even in the most difficult circumstances. Marcus had published a book about his experience, not the sensationalized memoir that publishers had initially wanted, but a thoughtful exploration of identity, family, and the ways that love persists across time and trauma. The book had been modestly successful, touching readers who had experienced their own forms of loss and displacement. He donated a portion of the proceeds to organizations that help missing children and their families, finding purpose in the idea that his story might help others navigate similar tragedies. The music box that had triggered his recovered memories sat now on the piano in his Burlington apartment, a bridge between his two worlds. He wound it often while composing, letting the familiar melody of Fur Elise remind him of the 7-year-old boy who had loved bedtime stories and model airplanes, and the 32-year-old man who had learned to find beauty in complexity and healing in the patient work of building new relationships while honoring old ones. On quiet evenings, when the Vermont mountains were purple with sunset and his apartment filled with the golden light that meant home, Marcus would play the melody from memory, his fingers finding the notes that connected past and present, loss and recovery, the child he had been and the man he had become. The music flowed from his hands like a prayer of gratitude for all the people who had loved him, those who had searched for him, those who had raised him, those who had welcomed him home, and those who had taught him that belonging was large enough to hold multiple truths. The mystery of Michael Torres's disappearance had been solved, but the more profound mystery of how love survives across time and distance, and even the cruelest disruptions, continued to unfold in the daily choices Marcus made to honor all the connections that had shaped him. He was living proof that some stories don't end with simple resolutions, but with the deeper understanding that healing is possible, that families can expand beyond biology and geography, and that the melodies we carry in our hearts continue to play long after the music box stops turning. In Cedar Falls, Elena Torres would still wind the music box in her son's preserved bedroom from time to time, listening to Fur Elise and thinking about the miracle of having her child return to her as a grown man she was still learning to know. In Burlington, Robert and Catherine Wellington would hear the same melody drifting from their son's apartment when he visited, and they would smile knowing that the boy they had raised with such love had found a way to honor all the families that had shaped him. The song played on, connecting past and present, loss and recovery, the boy who had vanished and the man who had learned to be found in multiple places at once. And in that music, complex and layered and beautiful, despite its origins and tragedy, was the truth that love is stronger than loss, that home is larger than any single place, and that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from returning to what was, but from creating something entirely new from the pieces of what remains. If stories like Sarah's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the melodies of love continue to play, waiting to guide us home. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart.